There's a recent video about what happened to Canada, and I do have some general theories because this is more of an economic type video. And frankly, there was a law that was passed not that long ago in Canada barring people that aren't Canadian citizens from buying Canadian homes and Canadian real estate, and for good reason. There's a lot of cash coming from foreign entities in buying up real estate because it seems like a good investment. My wife happens to be from a country in Southeast Asia, which I feel like if I say that country's name half the time, I wind up getting flagged on YouTube for certain reasons. But the country begins with a T, and I love that country. That being said, she was mentioning that there's a huge influx of Chinese citizens that buy up a ton of real estate in places like Canada, and it also pops up a lot on the west coast of the United States, and it makes it that much harder to buy real estate as somebody from that area because there's a ton of money in China, and if you happen to be very wealthy in China, you are like supremely wealthy. Granted, that wealth doesn't exactly spread very well amongst the rest of the Chinese citizens, but if you're wealthy, you are wealthy. To the point that I went to a major city in Canada not that long ago, and I honestly felt more like I was in a city-wide version of Chinatown. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but it just seemed like it really felt like a country just being taken over by an outside entity that's just being bought up. So I'm curious if they're going to go into that much with this video, but the disparity between how much it costs to buy land or property in Canada versus its income is extreme, and it's becoming even more extreme than the United States. So let's dive into this one.
Covering business, finance, and economics every week can be a little bit depressing. In just the last 2 years, personal savings have been evaporated, consumer debt has hit record highs, the job market has been defined by anti-worker trends such as ghost jobs, broad sector layoffs, and gigification.
The ghost jobs are driving me insane, by the way. The ghost jobs are all about pretending to have real jobs out there that are totally fake, because a company will get tax breaks and easier access to loans if they can say that they are hiring. But in actuality, they're not really hiring. They just cancel that job posting soon after they post it and then repost it 2 weeks later because they don't actually want anybody in the first place.
All while asset prices have ballooned far faster than household incomes or even their intrinsic fundamentals. The results have been pretty simple. It's getting much harder for people who work for a living to keep up with those who already have assets. Even the most diligent and career-focused people are finding it tough to make ends meet, let alone accumulate assets so that they too can one day achieve financial security. But even if you are feeling it's all a bit hopeless, just remember, it could be worse. You could be from Canada.
How the hell is anyone?
I can't imagine it's that. Like, I've been hearing a lot of people struggling in the US. If it's that much worse in Canada, that's scary.
When existing in Canada, I feel trapped.
It's saying house prices in Vancouver are expected to rise, get back to the peak where they were at 2 years ago.
His landlord did pay for her to live in a motel for a short period of time, but that has ended. She says her only option was to move into her shed.
There's no place else you can afford to live.
As Canadian students head back to school, a growing number are still trying to find work.
The latest U.S. Census data shows in 2022, more than 126,000 people moved from Canada to the United States.
Okay, so...
And that's actually become an issue, especially in places like New York, because it's actually driving down the incomes, because people in Canada can go to school for free, which isn't a thing in the US, but because they don't have to pay for student loans like all of the Americans do, or all of the United States citizens, because Canada is still part of North America, so I don't want to confuse that. But because of that, Canadians move down, they can take a slightly lower job as far as their salary because they don't have to worry about those student loans, and they can basically outbid or underbid United States citizens, which is, again, becoming its own problem.
A big problem across the world right now are figures like GDP, stock market prices, and unemployment numbers that look really, really good, but don't actually help out the people whose incomes have not kept up with productivity, don't own stock, and are working 4 of the new jobs that have been created and are still struggling with bills. But in Canada, not even the big picture numbers look good anymore. GDP growth has been sluggish, and because of population growth driven by high levels of immigration, GDP per capita hasn't really improved at all over the last 10 years. Unemployment is also higher than in America, and average annual wages are far lower. However, there is one area where they have a commanding lead over the USA, and that's average home prices. The average Canadian earns less, and has to pay much more for a place to live.
Oh, I didn't know it was that extreme.
Making one of the biggest problems in the world right now far worse for our northern brothers. Now, Canada's biggest
Like, that is a skyrocket. Like we had some serious uptick in the US, but I didn't know it was that extreme in
exports
Canada.
have always been natural resources, manufactured goods, and YouTube videos about how f***ed up their housing market is. So this probably doesn't need to be said again, except that a lot of this is missing a much more important problem. This is probably going to be shocking to you, but America has an unaffordable housing problem too, and so does most of the developed world. But Canada is still a little bit different. Comparing the price of real estate worldwide is actually incredibly difficult, because a city like Tokyo is certainly more expensive per square foot than San Francisco. But there are also a lot more small budget friendly-ish apartments for regular people to live in.
Yeah, you can't really compare when it's just per square foot, because a lot of places are just used to a smaller square footage for their properties. But also in places like Tokyo, it's much more common to just tear down and rebuild consistently. So you always have a newer place that's more of what's sought after. Where in the United States, having a grand traditional house that's probably been around for 50 or 100 years is far more accepted, meaning that home values can continue to go up at extreme rates. But at the same time, places in Tokyo, you can also get like those micro apartments where you can barely fit a bed in it.
Which is why, even though it looks almost twice as expensive, the city has been praised for its housing affordability. Here in the United States of urban sprawl, our average dwelling might be more expensive, but it's also a lot larger. So, if you can afford a home, it's probably going to be more comfortable than a similarly priced dwelling in more compact cities. Anyway, a city like Vancouver is roughly the same as a city like Seattle. They have a similar population, similar cultural preferences for freestanding homes spread out around a business district, and they are even relatively close to one another. The price of the average home in the Vancouver metropolitan area is slightly more expensive than the average in Seattle. But Seattle has a median household income more than twice as high as Vancouver, thanks largely to big tech companies like Microsoft and Amazon, which have their global headquarters in the city, as well as...
Yeah, I know a handful of people that work in Seattle. Every one of them basically works for the big tech companies like Microsoft and Amazon because they pay so insanely well, which is also part of what drove up the prices so much, because people with big budgets came in.
There's dozens of other major tech companies and supporting firms which have big offices there as well. These companies employ lots of people in very well compensated roles, so they have pushed up the price of real estate in places like San Francisco, New York, and Seattle. As someone who has personally moved to one of these cities to work one of these jobs myself, I am well aware of the problems they cause for locals who can't afford to live in their own homes, but it does at the very least make sense. People with good jobs can afford to pay higher rents, and since those high-paying jobs are only really available in a few cities, they become very expensive. In the States, real estate prices have been driven by a few concentrated industries, but in Canada, real estate is the industry. According to a report by the OECD, real estate in Canada contributed 40% of its capital investment. The USA, by comparison, was only 20%. Hilariously, this statistic was proudly reported on by the country's largest real estate agency in a post they made this time last year.
I don't get it. Why are they confessing?
They're not confessing.
They're bragging.
Vancouver doesn't have the same availability of jobs where young professionals can make life-changing amounts of money before they are 30 and then move out.
I mean, he stated it early in the video that the population has been vastly increasing at a pretty substantial rate, but a lot of that is because of immigration. And a lot of the immigration that's happening is by really wealthy people. So if you do that, they're going to drive up the prices of everything because they can afford it. You're not, there's this mentality a lot, especially in the United States, that like if an immigrant comes in, they're probably like, don't have as much money or something like that. But when immigrants come in that have lots of money, it can be damaging to certain markets for the locals.
It's largely a regular city for regular people with opportunities that are not particularly remarkable. To put it another way, nobody is moving to Vancouver to try to get ahead financially like they are in Seattle, and the data backs this up as well. According to the most recent census data from both of these cities, the average age of someone living in Vancouver was 4 years older than someone living in Seattle. This just makes all the problems people are facing a lot worse, because if you live in these cities, your financial situation is not defined by your income or even how financially responsible you are. It depends almost entirely on if you own a home or not. A renter who is a highly skilled professional with diligent savings and an investment plan is going to be financially crushed by someone with an average income and no financial discipline, simply because rent is so high and houses make more money than their inhabitants. Now again, the Canadian real estate market is f***ed up. You didn't need me to tell you that, but a lot of people leave it at just that. But hot take alert, expensive real estate is not a problem if incomes keep up with prices. Homes in West Virginia seem cheap to Californians, but they would be very expensive to someone living in Bangladesh because of the income differences between these areas. So while it's not as fun as opening up Zillow north of the border and doing some sweejack face to a derelict home that costs more than I will ever make in my lifetime, we do need to dig a little bit deeper. What is actually important in Canada is understanding how it actually got this bad without the household incomes to support it, and what the actual long-term consequences are of this mess. Even for the homeowners, this is not a great situation to be in. So it's time to learn how money works to find out what the f they are doing in America's hat. This week's video is sponsored by Delete Me.
Delete Me.
/ What was it?
Okay.
Well, there are actually 3 factors at play here.
I'll include a link to this video down below in case you want to check it out in its entirety without me interrupting all the time. And it will probably include the link to the sponsor of the video. So.
My friend Richard from The Plain Bagel actually did a great deep dive on exactly this problem last year, and as a Canadian financial professional, his insights on the topic are definitely worth hearing if you want a more in-depth analysis. The first reason is that Canada is actually surprisingly concentrated. It's the second biggest country in the world, but most of its people live close to the southern border in just a small handful of cities.
Yeah, because you don't want to live super far north where you're going to freeze your ass off and feel like you're going to die.
Those small cities are largely surrounded by lots of protected natural areas, which makes them lovely places to live. But it also means that when combined with very tight zoning regulations, there just isn't that much place to build new houses. And our Canadian brothers seem to be even more resistant to medium-density housing than we are. The second reason is that Canada never really experienced the housing shock of 2008. Their financial sector was a little less jacked to its tits than ours. And they were helped a lot by resource exports to China, so as American real estate was experiencing a massive reset, Canadian property prices barely budged, and any losses were made back within just a few months.
That's something I didn't know, especially that, housing prices took a pretty solid dip after 2008. So if that never happened in Canada, that just means they just kept going up, and they were going extreme for a while. That's a scary notion.
This meant that their homes stayed relatively expensive, and investors never got rattled like they did in America, where many people lost everything and became very wary about going all in on real estate again. The third reason is simply immigration. Canada welcomes about 1/5 as many immigrants into the country every year as the USA, but we have 8 times the population and a lot more cities to take everybody, and even some of the most pro-immigration pundits are admitting that even we are having problems. In Canada, migration is also a little bit different, because a higher share of new arrivals are already relatively wealthy people moving to the country who come through skilled or student visa programs.
Exactly. You got really rich people coming into the country, and you got a huge amount of them because they have a fifth They have a fraction of our population, but are taking in so many. That's intense.
Programs. For some of these people, the job opportunities in Canada are entirely secondary to its political stability, safe environment, and strong property rights. A home in Canada is a very safe way to park money in a country that has its problems, to be fair, but is still relatively safe compared to some countries where people feel like the government could seize their wealth at any given moment.
Yeah, see, he's even referencing the fact that, like, if you got Chinese investors with lots and lots of money, they can come in, buy a bunch of real estate, and they keep it out of the hands of the Chinese government, where it's always at risk of just being taken away.
This has led to a strategy known as land banking, where people will get a family member with a visa of some sort, often just a student residency, to buy a property purely as a safe store of value. Now, to be fair, the Canadian government is aware of this, and they have implemented new taxes on vacant dwellings, but it remains a popular way for people to keep their money safe, especially since people have figured out creative strategies for avoiding this tax anyway. For others, it's a lot easier to get a skilled worker visa in Canada than it is in the US, so even if jobs don't pay as well up there, they pay a lot better than similar work in developing countries. Now, this immigration has been used to help support an aging population and fill in skill gaps that existing Canadians just aren't paid enough to do. But it's been seen by investors as further proof that buying real estate is always going to be a safe bet because the government needs to bring more people into the country to keep things working. Now, this is still only half.
The government trapped themselves. So now they're just stuck. They're like, oh, we got to keep bringing people in, and we got to keep bringing really rich people in because that's just what's happening at this point. And now it's just going to keep furthering and furthering the problem because we're no longer self-reliant.
Half the problem, but it does impact the other half as well. Canadians love investing in housing, but it's been so good that they haven't been as excited about investing in anything else. And when they do invest in actual businesses that generate cash flow, US-based companies have been more attractive than their own homegrown businesses. The entire combined market capitalization of the biggest listed companies in Canada is less than Apple, Microsoft, or Nvidia individually. This is why Canadian companies can't pay
Like, one company takes on their whole GDP. That's nuts.
as well as the big American companies. And this also means that a lot of talent leaves Canada to get better paying jobs here in the States. If you had the choice between living in Toronto, where the average house costs 4 times as much as the average in Houston, and you could make more money down in Texas, which would you choose? I'm actually asking. If you are Canadian, leave a comment down below. Let's take a little poll here. Either way, hundreds of thousands of mostly young Canadians are making that move every year, making the country even more dependent on immigration to avoid catastrophe. Even outside of attracting financing, starting a business is much.
So all the local Canadians are running away scared, and all of the government's like, well, if we're losing Canadians, we need to immigrate more people so that way we can still at least keep up what we have. They're really starting to shoot themselves in the foot.
Harder in Canada because of generally less business-friendly regulations, a smaller domestic market, less talent, and the fact that commercial real estate is expensive too. Canada is a clear example that a real estate problem can become an everything problem, and it can be hard to realize this until it's too late. Slowly letting down this house of cards without blowing up record levels of household debt is potentially going to last decades. Already, people are struggling because almost all mortgages in Canada are given on adjustable rates, which means that as rates have increased to combat inflation, the rates people are paying on their mortgages have also gone up considerably, even if they originally took on the mortgage when rates were low. Some mortgage repayments have doubled or tripled in the last 4 years, making it hard for a lot of families to afford much else besides the roof over their head. So yeah, Canada might make you feel better, but don't get too smug just yet. Here in America, we are not too far behind, and our lending standards are not as robust as Canada's. Canada is keeping their housing market afloat with the immigration fire hose. We are doing it with 1% down payment mortgages and corporate real estate investments. Our incomes may on average be higher, but that's pulled up by a lot of few extremely high-income earners in the concentrated industries that have made places like Seattle and San Francisco into what they are today.
Yeah, if you take away the top couple percent, then that general income, household income might drop a decent amount.
unaffordable, gentrified hellscapes. The income floor in Canada for the people most hurt by unaffordable housing is higher, assuming they can find a job. Now, if you are Canadian and these videos got you feeling a bit depressed, just remember it could be worse. You could be Australia. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see us cover that clusterfuck.
I am now super curious about that. But I think I knew that the immigration problem contributing to the real estate prices was an issue. I didn't know it was that extreme. The fact, I know that the government has tried to do a couple things to combat it, but they obviously need to be doing more. They need to go ahead and just completely ban non-residents from buying land, I would assume. I don't know the full implications of that. I'm not an economist, but if you just implemented a tax on unoccupied housing like they have, it's so easy to get around that. People that are wealthy have the ability to get around taxes more easily than anybody else because they have the time and the money to find the loopholes. You need to be a little bit harsher and be able to crack down on it. Otherwise, it sounds like this problem is only starting to explode.